In the last episode, we went over the general idea of how people learn from tutorials. Some people use surface level approaches, others use deep level approaches. But how does this relate to video games? Can't we use the same principles for game tutorials as we would for traditional tutorials? Well, let's take a look. Game tutorials are fairly similar to traditional tutorials in the sense that they teach a subject and present the information in a way that's easy to understand regardless of the student's experience. Ideally, both new players and experienced players should be receiving the same amount of instruction. They're also similar in structure. Most game tutorials function in the form of text, with some related image displayed on screen. Other types come in the form of an interactive tutorial requiring the player to do something.
You're not coming?
But when compared to traditional tutorials, there's one big difference. Games usually don't have an instructor. Not in the literal sense, as some games might have an in-game character teaching the player, but rather in the sense that the tutorial is static. The tutorial will present large amounts of information as is, with little to no way for the player to further clarify or ask questions. Now, this might sound inefficient, but there's a good reason for this. Galen Midford, a learning experience designer, explains that because there's no instructor, game tutorials need to be completely self-contained and efficient so users can navigate through it on their own. It also needs to account for how users may learn in different ways. Midford explains that when it comes to video games, there are generally two types of learners. The first type are those who learn through demonstration. These types of players like to have the information presented beforehand so they can get an idea of what might happen and prepare accordingly. The second type are those who learn through experimentation. These types of players prefer to test things out through doing something, similar to a trial and error approach. Midford again explains that neither one of these styles is wrong, but the game needs to account for both types. Here's a table from the article that shows some of the general do's and don'ts for creating game tutorials. We can see that some of the negative traits fall in line with how some gamers like to learn. For example, players that learn through experimentation ideally wouldn't like tutorials that handhold or dump a ton of information on them. Midford goes on to explain that since games have such a broad spectrum, with different genres and varying levels of complexity, this table doesn't do them justice. So instead of using this table as an absolute, they provide three general categories that most games fall under. Small games that can be accessed easily on a phone or online, medium games that typically live on home consoles but have a fairly low entry barrier for users, and large, complex games that have complete worlds and lore created around them. Midford uses Candy Crush as an example for a game that's small and simple. Candy Crush has two mechanics, tapping and swiping. Midford explains that because of smartphones, tapping and swiping have become an established human norm. The game takes advantage of this, using colorful icons to teach the player how the mechanics work. Medium games have much more complex mechanics and usually feature controllers or a keyboard and mouse. For example, Minecraft, a sandbox block game, has many different mechanics for movement, a crafting system, and other features that generate within the world. These mechanics are taught through the crafting interface and the advancements tab, providing a short description of what is required for those milestones. However, These advancements are optional, allowing the player to choose how they want to play. It's completely acceptable to play Minecraft by just breaking and placing blocks, or dabbling in the creative mode, which gives the player access to everything in the game with no consequences. Large, complex games, also known as AAA games, have in-depth worlds with complex storylines, lore, and even economies. Midford explains that these types of games risk the most in their tutorials because of the sheer amount of information that's required to pass on to the player. Because of this, these games use a specific tool to help pull the player in, called in medias res. Translating to in the middle of things, this is a tool used in many forms of entertainment to quickly grab the attention of the audience. Here's an example. At the beginning of the game Persona 5, the player is dropped into a chase scene. During this sequence, the player is taught basic movement mechanics, basic battle mechanics, and bits of the story and world. Midford explains that, by focusing on the story and immersing users directly into a dramatic moment, the technique draws their attention to the material and they are given a reason to invest their time in the content. In other words, by associating these mechanics with an intense sequence, the player is more likely to retain the information. With this, Midford simplifies what the strengths of these game tutorials are. Small game tutorials focus on simplicity, with straightforward mechanics that a player can retain in seconds. Medium game tutorials focus on flexibility, giving the player information where necessary while also giving them the freedom to try things out. And lastly, large game tutorials focus on the storytelling methodology, using the game's story and world in conjunction with the mechanics to immerse the player in the experience. Let's explore this immersion a bit more. By definition, immersion is instruction based on extensive exposure to surroundings or conditions that are native or pertinent to the object of study. But that's not exactly what we're looking for. The definition we're looking for is closer to the definition of engross, which is to take or engage the whole attention of, or occupy completely. In terms of video games, this means that the player temporarily adopts or empathizes with the emotions and moods of an in-game character or situation. The article Psychology of Popular Media dives into the idea of immersion in video games and how the player role-plays the character they control. Alongside studying immersion, they were also studying projection. Projection is defined as the attribution of one's own ideas, feelings, or attitudes to other people or objects. The article explains that this usually happens when the player avatar is a neutral container, allowing the player to apply their own personality onto them. In other words, if the player's character does not have a predefined personality, the player will use their own personality as a substitute, essentially inserting themselves into the game. Going back to the table we used earlier, we can see how these two things are important to the previously mentioned large game type, where the story and world are at the forefront of the game's focus. If the game or game's tutorial does anything to pull the player out of their immersed or projecting state, their experience becomes much more negative. Compiling these things together, we can see why immersion is one of, if not the biggest factor in differentiating traditional tutorials from game tutorials. This is because immersion helps with the process of information retention. By connecting game tutorials with their respective game worlds, it allows players to associate the tutorials with their gameplay experiences. Traditional tutorials usually lack this type of immersion, as they are more focused on teaching the subject itself rather than the learning experience as a whole. We've gone through quite a bit to understand how game tutorials work and how they function within the games they come from. Now, with this information, we can go back and answer the question we posed at the very start. What makes a good game tutorial?